on Europe's migrant crisis.
Tonight, the nations of Europe are confronting their biggest collective crisis of recent times, the mass migration of people from some of the world's most troubled regions. At the end of a harrowing week, we'll be tracking those desperate journeys and we'll be assessing the world's response. Good evening. The refugee crisis that has focused the world's attention this week has been several years in the making, driven by a destructive mix of conflict and violence in Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan, in Libya and other regions of North Africa. But it took one searing image earlier this week to produce an evident change in public opinion here in the UK and indeed around the world. Most important challenge for years to come. So in this BBC News special, with the help of our correspondents, we'll be tracking the journeys of those people who are on the move. Millions have fled the violence in Syria. We'll be talking to Jeremy Bowen in the port of Latakia. Another departure point for refugees is Libya. Quentin Somerville is in Tripoli for us. We have Emily Maitlis in Budapest. And we have Lucy Manning in Calais, where the French and British governments have so far failed to find a way forward. Before we track those journeys, here's our special correspondent Fergal Keane with his account of a fateful week for the refugees and indeed for Europe.
From across the seas, along endless roads, from the east, from Africa, a story of departure, driven by desperation and by hope. We live in a great age of migration. They are refugees from war, or come fleeing poverty and oppression. To them, our Europe is the Europe of the rule of law, of work, of education. A promise for which they will risk everything. But it is the story of Syria's refugees which has this week forced the crisis to the forefront of the public imagination and political debate. It is a story of millions of people fleeing a nation that's been torn apart. They've spilled across international borders. Now 4 million live outside their country. I've followed the Syrian refugee trail since the first terrified people came over the borders of Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey. For the children, how frightening is it, the war?
They keep screaming, they can't sleep, they cry all the time.
All day people are continuing to arrive here, some 3,000 in the last 24 hours, and we're told there are tens of thousands more waiting on the other side of the border. All of this is putting a huge strain on the resources of the camp.
The refugees told me stories of death and suffering at the regime's hands.
طلعنا بالشحن قوصونا نحن صرنا على حاجز ما استمح لي قوصونا وهربانين عالم كتير معانا بيت جيراننا وفي شهيد مات شهيد مات.
And long before the death of Alan Kurdi and his brother, children, hundreds of thousands, ended up in camps like Zatri, existing on handouts. But the Arab world and the rest of the international community failed to meet its promises on aid.
We've done as well as we can given the resources that we've got, which is that we've got no resources anymore. We need money now desperately to expand this camp as well as open to others.
For people who had homes and jobs, who were farmers or craftsmen, life in the camps often led to despair.
This is a disaster. Disaster. There is no value for the child, for a human being. No value at all. Where's the humanity?
This week in the Turkish town of Izmir, I met hundreds of new arrivals from Syria, hoping to reach Europe and to get away from dependency. The charity of strangers has its limits. When I met Khaled Iqbal and his daughter Wade, they were hoping to get to Greece. He had his leg blown off in Syria and wants an education for his 18-year-old daughter.
I want to reach Europe, he told me, and get a better life for me and an education for my children.
But on the same day, the refugee crisis would produce an image but too many.
That was Fergal Keane on the events of this week. Now, it is important to underline that the numbers of refugees and migrants reaching Europe are significantly smaller than the numbers in the Middle East, where 4 million Syrians have fled to neighbouring countries, including Turkey and Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt and Jordan. So how does that compare with the situation inside the European Union? Clive Myrie has been studying those figures.
The numbers involved in this ongoing drama are truly staggering. Look at this. Not far off 500,000 asylum applications have been made in Europe so far this year. 438,000 according to the UN. Here in the UK, 25,000 have applied. In Germany, where it seems many refugees want to go, there were 188,000. But in Sweden, there have been 8 applications for asylum for every 1,000 people in the country. More per head of population than Germany. So it's obvious Europe is a place where many believe they'll be welcomed and can find safe haven. The EU's border force Frontex reckons 350,000 people have crossed into Greece and Italy this year so far. Around 94,000 Syrians escaping the civil war there. 32,000 more have reached the EU from Afghanistan. Add to that another 26,000 from Eritrea, escaping a repressive dictatorship. And 12,000 from Nigeria. Some economic migrants, others fleeing the Islamist militants of Boko Haram. And how are all these people getting to Europe? Well, there are 3 main routes. Through the central Mediterranean, just over 91,000 so far this year got in that way. A little more than 102,000 used the path through the Western Balkans, up through Hungary, which has of course been in the news most recently. Interestingly, some of those taking this route are Europeans, economic migrants, mainly Albanians and others from the former Yugoslavia. Then there's the Eastern Mediterranean route from Turkey, used by the Kurdi family, resulting in the deaths of Aylan, who was 3, and his brother, their bodies washed up on a beach this week. But Europe's challenge in dealing with the current migration crisis is dwarfed by that of Syria's neighbours. Remember, 4 million people have fled the war. The overwhelming majority are in refugee camps in places like Lebanon and Turkey.
Clive Myrie there. So this evening we're going to chart the journeys of hundreds of thousands of desperate people making their way to different parts of Europe. And we'll start in Syria. That is where the conflict is still displacing people by the day, added to the millions who've already fled. It's thought that 2 million Syrians have crossed into neighbouring Turkey. We'll then go to Libya, where people traffickers are busy sending refugees across the Mediterranean from troubled Eritrea and Somalia and Nigeria. Thousands, of course, have made it to the Greek island of Kos, but many have drowned on the way. And from there we'll move to Central Europe, to Hungary and beyond, a favoured route of so many who have one ideal destination in mind, and that is Germany, where they are expecting to take 800,000 refugees this year, far more than any other European country. Others, of course, have made it to France, northern France, and to the port of Calais, from where they hope to reach the United Kingdom. And today there's been a shift in the British government's position on taking more refugees. We'll have the latest on that. So let's start then with this journey in the country that is engulfed in violence, that's Syria, where so many of the refugees have come from. Our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen, is in the port of Latakia tonight.
Well, becoming a refugee is not a decision that people take lightly. It means leaving your home, leaving your family, your friends, everything that's familiar and that you might hold dear. And people take a decision like that because they fear that otherwise they might get killed, or because their homes have been destroyed, or because they don't want to see their children growing up with little chance of education in a country like this, in Syria, where the fabric of the nation is being shattered by war. Now, the first step is often to become internally displaced. In other words, becoming a refugee in your own country. in the city where I am, Latakia, on Syria's Mediterranean coast, and in the surrounding district, there is an estimate that there are about 1 million internally displaced people. People who've lost their homes, sometimes more than once, and have come here. And life isn't easy. This street is pretty dark, and that's because there's no mains electricity. All the power comes from generators. You might hear a few of them going on in the background. And if they want to take another step, which is to cross the border and to start a long journey, perhaps as far as Europe or further still, then from here in Latakia, the borders of Lebanon and Turkey aren't all that far away.
Jeremy Bowen. Well, 2 million Syrians have already fled to neighbouring Turkey. There are more people arriving there every day. Turkey has warned repeatedly that it can't cope with the scale of the influx. Our international correspondent Ian Pannell is on Turkey's border with Syria. We can join him now.
Thanks very much, Hugh. Well, it's fair to say that Turkey has taken in more Syrian refugees than any other country. In fact, almost half of those people who fled Syria have ended up here. Many of them are living in makeshift camps in rudimentary conditions. We've watched people over the years clamber over borders to safety, desperate to get away from the fighting. Men, women and children with all the possessions that they can carry, getting away from the fighting that's taking place, going over border fences, sometimes going under barbed wire. But here's the problem. Although they have managed to find safety, what they haven't found, for many at least, is some sense of a future inside Turkey. And that's what's causing a lot of the problems that we find. So many are now living in makeshift camps, like the one behind me, living in incredibly tough conditions. Others are living in towns and cities across Turkey, and many describe life as intolerable. They're not given refugee status, they're not allowed citizenship, and they're not given work permits. Now, this isn't the case for everybody, but for a lot of them, they can't find jobs, and when they do, the pay is very low. Rents are very high, and making ends meet is incredibly tough. People ask, why could you put your children onto a boat and risk all this? Well, the answer for Hugh, for many here, is that, put simply, Europe looks like the promised land compared to what you see here.
Ian, many thanks. Ian Pannell there on Turkey's border with Syria. Well, the lack of any stable government in Libya means that is an ideal base for people traffickers and smugglers. They've sent many thousands in unsafe vessels across the Mediterranean. There were yet more drownings reported today. Our correspondent Quentin Somerville is in Tripoli this evening.
Hugh, we've been following these journeys for 2 years almost from Libya, and as this country deepens and falls into chaos, it gets deadlier here for refugees. The last week alone we saw 200 people drown in the waters just off Libya. Today perhaps as many as 50 died. Such is the chaos in this country. We don't know where they left from, and we don't know where the bodies of those men, women and children will arrive on the beaches on this coastline. Earlier I travelled to Zwara. My report contains some graphic images. It's the very heart of Libya's smuggling trade.
And that is where the 2 little Syrian brothers were among those who drowned earlier this week. Our correspondent Chris Buckler is on the island. We can join him now.
Hugh, during any normal summer, the seafront here at Kos would be lined with tourists. But this year, it's lined with tents, which people are using to get some shelter from the sun during the day and to keep warm during the night. Yet of all of the images, the most striking and horrifying is that of a 3-year-old boy's lifeless body, killed alongside around a dozen others as they tried to reach this island. Despite dangers and drownings, the sea is still proving no deterrent to families desperate to reach Europe. On a tiny dinghy, more people arrived on Kos this morning, chanting everything for a new life. They join tens of thousands who have travelled here and to Greece's other islands all summer. Places built for visitors, but which at times have felt less than welcoming. There have been queues, crushes and conflict. The frustration's obvious as refugees and migrants have had to wait days for the documents that will allow them to travel on to other parts of Europe. To tackle tension, tear gas has been used more than once. On islands like Lesbos, makeshift camps have been set up, but many are little more than waste ground, without the basic facilities needed by the thousands of people who have found themselves stuck here. To try to ease the pressure, the Greek government has been using a cruise liner to ferry refugees to Athens. And you can see the relief when they reach this stage of their journey into Europe.
Chris Buckler there on the Greek island of Kos. Now, Hungary is the latest country in Central Europe to be facing its own refugee crisis. The Keleti rail station in Budapest, as we've seen, is now a kind of refugee camp for those waiting to travel on to Austria and Germany. Let's join Emily Maitlis, who's there.
Never before, Hugh, has that description of Hungary, Central Europe seemed more appropriate. The people here have left the harshness of the East, but they have yet to arrive at what they consider to be the sanctuary of the West. They are in limbo. Why? Because Hungary is, to all intents and purposes, a gateway to a zone of free movement throughout many EU member states, the last country of border control. In other words, if people can leave here, they can get to pretty much anywhere. But at the moment, authorities have tightened restrictions to slow down the flow, to stop people coming in. And so you have this chaos, you have this confusion, but above all, you have this sense that ordinary life has to go on. And the youngest Syrian refugee we met this morning was a little baby, Seta, just 4 days old, born on the station floor. Whatever you think of the situation, an extraordinary way to begin a life. Right now we can join Matthew Price, who we understand is marching north towards the Austrian border with migrants there.
Emily, this is something we hear a lot about, but we don't often see, and we certainly don't see it live. This is Europe's migration flow. It's refugee crisis playing out in front of us at the moment. These are some of the, I estimate, about 1,000 people who have been marching from where you are, the station in Budapest, through the afternoon and now into the night, and they are heading in the direction behind me, the direction of Austria. They say they're simply fed up that they were having to spend all that time at the train station and weren't being allowed to leave the country that they wanted to leave. Most of them say they're going to get into Austria and then they want to go on to Germany. It's mostly men, but look here, this young boy fast asleep on his father's shoulders, and for the children, this is an incredibly long journey. Why do the parents do it? Every single parent that I have spoken to says this isn't out of choice, it's out of necessity. And they do it for the future of their children, like that little boy.
Matthew, thanks very much. Matthew Price there with the refugees marching out of Budapest and towards the Austrian border. Time and again in Budapest this week, I heard Syrians chanting the name of their favoured destination, no doubt about it, Germany. And Germany is planning to take as many as 800,000 refugees this year, far more than any other EU country. And public opinion there is apparently supportive. Our Berlin correspondent Jenny Hill has this report for us.
Germany. This is the end of a long road. And maybe it's the start of a new life.
People in Germany very good. Thank you.
Volunteers provide hot drinks. There's donated clothing. This woman bought crayons for the children. This boy gave up his school holidays to help out.
I think the refugees had a really, really rough time, and I guess they really need it.
This is happening in towns and cities all over Germany. The government reckons some 800,000 people will seek asylum here this year alone. That's more than anywhere else in Europe.
And officially, they're welcome. Some say this country is too open. But in the words of the Chancellor Angela Merkel, we're fulfilling our moral and legal obligations. Germany will offer protection.
Well, this evening I'm at Munich railway station, where every day hundreds of refugees first arrive in the country. You can just see a group on the platform over here who've literally just stepped off a train from Vienna. This happens pretty much every hour, every day here in Munich railway station. Germany is unique for two reasons. First, the high number of asylum seekers it attracts, and secondly, the welcome they receive here.
Jenny, many thanks again. Jenny Hill there in Munich for us. For some, it has to be said, Germany is not the answer. Over recent months, one of the main flashpoints has been the port of Calais in northern France, where refugees and migrants make repeated attempts to climb into lorries to get through the Channel Tunnel to the UK. Our special correspondent, Lucy Manning, has the latest for us there.
Well, this is a corner of Calais in the camp now known as the Jungle. It's home to people from across the world. Walking through today, I've met people from Afghanistan, Syria, Sudan, Eritrea and Egypt. But it's not where they want to call home. Some people here have claimed asylum in France, but many, many more are making those nightly dangerous attempts to get over to the UK. And we saw that in the summer, refugees, migrants trying to get onto the lorries, trying to cut through the canvas and open the doors, and also cutting through the fences to get onto the trains as well. In the summer, there were thousands of attempts every night. Now that is down to a few hundred attempts, but they're still trying. And many people here are from war zones, and I asked them, why not stay in France? Why are you trying to make it to Britain? And they say that it is because of the language, it is easier in Britain for them, that many of them have family in the UK and they think the job prospects are better. But the announcement the government made to take more refugees, that doesn't apply to anyone here. And I met a group of Syrian refugees at a protest in the town centre who say that there are only around 120 Syrians in the camp here, and they say that's a small enough number that the UK should be able to take them. I mean, what is clear is that there isn't the numbers here who are trying to get into Britain comparable with those trying to get into Germany, but they are determined, and some of them are desperate. Tonight I was asked for tickets and for shoes.
Lucy, again, many thanks. Lucy Manning there for us in Calais. Well, the events of this week, especially the image of the little Syrian boy found on that Turkish beach, have swayed public opinion clearly, and it seems they've produced the change of policy in Downing Street. Let's talk to our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, who's there. Your reading of today's announcements, Laura?
Well, Hugh, David Cameron really did have to be pushed into taking more action. This was not Downing Street's plan, and as recently ago as 36 hours, promising that the UK will take thousands more refugees directly from the borders of Syria now. But tonight there's still no agreement on what that actual number will be. And in a sense, how Downing Street's found themselves outpaced by this week's events is a tiny metaphor for what's happened to Europe's political leaders this summer. They've almost been left reeling by the scale of what has happened. Colleagues of David Cameron have told me he saw dealing with this as the first big test of his new government after the general election some weeks ago. Well, just this week, that has proved a very difficult test to pass. But it's not about one boy, one boat, or even one country. Britain has given much more generously to refugees on the ground. But like his neighbours, there's such a mismatch between Europe's leaders' response so far and the scale of the situation that we're seeing right across this continent. Whose responsibility it is quite another matter.
Laura, many thanks. Laura Kuenssberg there in Downing Street. You've been watching a BBC News special on Europe's biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War. There'll be more at 10 on BBC One, but for now, a moment to reflect on some of the week's heartrending images. Goodbye.
No.